Okay, let's talk for a moment about the Gospel of Luke. For the purpose of this class, we're actually combining Luke and Acts, as most textbooks will, because Luke Acts, it appears, were written together originally as one volume, only to be separated later. Of course, they're both believed to be written by Luke, as you probably already know. And interestingly enough, the action that happens in Luke and in Acts are they mirror each other. All of the action in Luke is going towards Jerusalem, and then in Acts, everything is going away from Jerusalem as the kingdom spreads. Regarding authorship, there is obviously internal and external evidence that strongly suggests that Luke, the doctor, is indeed the author of the book of Acts, or book of Luke and Acts. The prologue, of course, makes it clear that the author was not an eyewitness. We, of course, know also from the many passages in Acts where the pronoun "we" is used. So clearly, the person who wrote Acts was a companion of Paul, and so we know that Luke was a companion of Paul, and so internally those are some of the clues that we get. Externally, there are a number of the early church fathers and others who cite Luke as the author of the gospel. Marcion, who was actually a heretic, and Justin Martyr, both in the mid-2nd century, refer to Luke as the author of that gospel. Irenaeus also claimed Luke to be the author, as well as Tertullian, who wrote around the beginning of the 2nd century. So really, all of these outside folks from even the turn of the century gave credit to Luke as the author of the gospel. The oldest manuscripts of Luke date back to AD, sometime between AD 75 and 225, and they also ascribe it to Luke. So there's really no dispute really as to Luke being the author. In fact, it would be strange because if he wasn't, because if they wanted to give an authorship to someone, they probably wouldn't have chosen a doctor. They would have chosen an apostle, perhaps. So it's very, very, very likely Luke wrote the book. As far as the date goes, most believe that the book was written in the 60s AD. The reason for that is because Acts makes no mention of key events from the time period of 65 AD to 70 AD, as we would expect if it had been written afterwards. Nero's persecution, of course, happened during that time, as well as the death of Peter and Paul, and the destruction of Jerusalem, none of which are mentioned in the book of Acts. And so, in fact, nothing in the book of Acts is later than 62 AD. Luke spends much of the last part of Acts describing Paul's arrests, his trials, and his journey to Rome, and it ends with Paul's imprisonment in Rome, which may actually indicate to us when that book was completed. We'll talk more about Paul and his time frame when we get to his letters. But in terms of dating Acts, of course, there's the prophecy of Agabus in chapter 11, verse 28, that is fulfilled but doesn't mention the fall of Jerusalem. And so, and Jesus' prophecy is recorded about that in Luke as well. Paul's released and actually visited Ephesus again. We know that to be true, even though Luke records in Acts that he would not see them again. So it would be, if it was a later date, that'd be a strange thing. So when Paul says to the Ephesian elders, "I won't see you again," he didn't believe he would, but he actually did. We know from history. So it would have been strange if that letter or the book had been written later. So that's a little bit about just the dating of Acts, and of course the authorship is really not in dispute. Now we talk about the purpose of Luke Acts. Luke himself says that he undertook the project to give an orderly account. Not quite sure if he was throwing some shade at Mark, but he definitely tells us that that's why he's writing his account. He tries to relate his story to the broader historical context. There's a lot of chronological references in identity. He identifies governing people in Palestine, Asia Minor, and Europe. A lot of little details that Luke gives us that some of the other Gospels don't. He has a historian's instinct for chronology and for causality. He makes connections between events, and so so there's a thread of purpose that runs through his narrative. Luke uses Mark differently than Matthew does. When he follows Mark's order, he does so more closely, although he tends to eliminate some of the blatant doubles that Mark uses, I mentioned earlier, and he does so. And unlike Matthew, Matthew actually multiplies those things. And so instead of inserting blocks of discourse material into a narrative framework, he alternates narratives and sayings a little bit more subtly. Luke does. Some of the main themes in the Gospel of Luke: God's plan, salvation. There's a focus on Gentiles as recipients of God's salvation, which makes sense. If Luke was a companion of Paul and they're witnessing to the Gentiles, certainly his gospel is going to be oriented towards inclusion of the Gentiles, more so perhaps than the other gospels. And he seems to give a lot more, show a lot more concern for outcasts of society. A lot more can be said about Luke and Acts. Again, take a look at the textbook. There'll be a lot of information there for you, some background things to help you along your way. And we'll see you back on the webpage.